All your life, you have seen your parents, society, the priest, those temple, they are praying to something, someone, either a statue, photo, or up or down, and you believe that is God. Or praying to a book, believing that that is God. So you have picked up this understanding from the beginning, seeing others, and that becomes your reality. But you have not experienced what God is, you just believe it. And believing is like believing that water is dry, but actually water is wet. But you can experience water directly, you can touch it, you know it's wet. The same way, when you get into the experience, then you know what these words point to. What is reality and what is that looks real is just learnt, and because it is learnt, you see everything and that looks real, that looks true. But truth does not change. Even water can change into ice, then it does not remain water. You cannot say that is water, that is ice. So everything that is seen, heard, can be altered. That's why the word truth is used towards that what does not change. It does not change like body changes, it does not change how the materialistic things change, that remains intact. That is the source from everything arise, and it is only to be experienced, and the experience does not happen till the misunderstanding is clear, because it is not something that you will ever be able to see outwardly. It is something you experience inwardly, within, not something understood, but that itself experiencing itself. So there is this question, what is God? Where is God? But perhaps the first step is to know what God is not. What is imagined as God is not God. What the mind tries to picture is not God. What thinking tries to understand is not the divine. Thinking can only move through what has already been learned. Thought can only repeat what it already knows. So, whatever thought present as God is simply memory. What methods try to achieve is not God, because what can be achieved is something produced in time. But what is called divine cannot be produced. What many have tried to define is not God. Words can describe many things, but the word divine points to cannot be captured by definition. What images try to represent is not God. Statues, symbols, pictures, these are only expressions created by the human mind. What beliefs defend is not God. Belief is something the mind holds on to when it does not know. The divine does not depend on belief. What arguments try to prove is not God. Truth does not need proof in order to exist. So, if all of these are not God, then what is God? The answer begins to reveal itself when the movement of thought is seen clearly. Thinking can only present what has been learnt. But what is called divine is not something learned, it is not something added to the mind, it is what exists before thought begins to describe it. What methods try to achieve cannot reach it, because what is called divine or by many names is not an achievement. It is not something gained in the future, it is already present before the search begins. What words try to define cannot contain it, because words can only point, they cannot capture what is beyond language. Different traditions have used different names. God, Divine, Source, Allah, Data, Ram, many others. Different words, different cultures, different histories, but all of them are attempts to point towards the same reality, that which everything arises from. Everything that appears in the world, every object, every thought, every experience arises within itself. Even what is seen physically cannot appear without the mind first recognizing it with the help of thought. The physical world is known through perception, and perception itself arises in awareness. But even beyond what is mental and what is physical, something more fundamental is present, something prior to both. Before the mind names, before thought divides, before the world is interpreted. That silent background is always here. Everything appears within it, everything moves through it, everything returns to it. But it is not silence in the way the mind understands silence. It is not the silence that comes when thoughts stop. It is not the silence that comes when the world becomes quiet. Because even the silence can be noticed, and anything that can be noticed appears within something else. This is before that. Before noise, before silence, before the mind calls anything by a name. It is in which both sound and silence appears, like waves appearing on the surface of the ocean. The world rises and falls within that source, and that source is what have been named by many names. Not something separate from itself, not something located somewhere else, but the very ground from which everything exists. Yet this source experiences itself through contrast, through division, through illusion, through the mind separating one thing from another. Without contrast, nothing could be recognized. Consider a simple example. If a different name had been given at birth and life had unfolded under that name, that identity would have been believed to be real, truth. Only through careful investigation would it eventually be discovered that the identity was only something learned, something given, something accepted without question. In the same way, much of what is believed about the self is conditioning, thoughts, memories, identities. But none of these existed in the beginning. They were added over time. When attention looks deeply enough, something becomes clear. What was conditioned was never the true foundation, and what was never conditioned cannot be altered by thought. That which exists before words, before concepts, before identity, that is the source. That is what's called divine, that is what's called God. Not something far away, but the silent reality from which everything, including this very moment, is constantly arising. For many, it may begin simply as a desire to be free from the problems of life. It may begin through fear, through suffering, through love for God, or through a search for the divine. From that interest, the search begins. One starts reading, listening, and trying to understand. Words and knowledge begins to point in a certain direction, but slowly something deeper becomes clear. And when the movement of thought settles, what was taken to be real is seen as learnt, remembered. Not created now, only created from the past. And in that seeing, what is aware of it stands on its own. And true or truth is true knowledge, not something to achieve, not something to become, simply what is true, what is actual. Not imagined, not learnt, not carried from memory, that which exposes illusion and leaves only what is whole, undivided, that source itself, that reality itself. That's all there is, and that's all that which is seen separate also is part of that. Nothing outside of it. And what is believed to be a separate self is just illusion, learned. And only when you relax, when you meditate, when you don't plan this moment or spend this moment planning for a future or always visiting the past with the help of thought, memory, getting lost, but always just aware right here, right now, then it shines through. Not like a light that which is already lighting this body, igniting this vessel, that which is already functioning within this body, that cannot be seen like an object because that itself is aware of everything, mistaking itself to be something else.